Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here this evening, and thanks to Trauma Free NYC and the Center for Society and Science for hosting us this evening. So as a neuroscientist, I have to tell you that the human brain has been termed the most complex 3 pounds in the universe. And it's not hard to see why when we consider the fact that in the first few months of life, every minute we generate several 100,000 new neurons or brain cells. But what I think is particularly fascinating about this brain developmental process is that it's shaped by early experience. So you may have heard of the use it or lose it phenomenon, whereby connections that are used frequently are strengthened, whereas those that are not are dropped or pruned. And it turns out that the brain is most plastic or able to make new connections early in childhood. Now, in my lab, we focus on family, social, and economic circumstance. And of course, a child's experience varies tremendously as a function of his or her social and economic circumstance. And so we can use these factors as a lens through which to understand brain development. And so I'm going to be talking a bit this evening about poverty, which is one aspect of early adversity that certainly, while not encompassing all of trauma, is one circumstance that predisposes children to be more likely to experience trauma. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, what is poverty? Poverty is a number set by the federal government that varies by family size and the composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. Now, interestingly, it doesn't vary geographically. So a family of 4 living here in New York City has the same poverty line set for them as a family living in rural South Dakota, even though clearly the cost of living is quite different in those 2 places. Now, the current poverty line for a family with 2 adults and 2 kids is just under $25,000. And although it's quite challenging to imagine raising a family of 4 on that amount, especially in a high cost of living place like New York, it's nonetheless quite prevalent. And as we know, growing up in poverty puts children at risk for a host of negative outcomes in terms of their physical health, mental health, and school achievement. And as I mentioned, it's quite prevalent, so the purple line shows rates of childhood poverty over time, and we're currently hovering at around 1 in 5. Now, when I talk about socioeconomic status, or SES, I'm talking about more than just poverty. I just told you that poverty is strictly defined based on family income, whereas SES is defined based on income, but other characteristics as well, like parents' educational attainment, occupational prestige, and subjective social status, or where one sees oneself on the social hierarchy. And we know that childhood SES, when conceptualized in this way, tends to be strongly associated with a number of important childhood developmental outcomes, things like achievement tests, grade retention, literacy, IQ, and school graduation rate, to name a few. And in fact, the socioeconomic gap in achievement tends to emerge early and really widen throughout the early childhood years. So the data I'm about to show you are from the British cohort study of 1970, which followed tens of thousands of students longitudinally, or children longitudinally, in the UK from about age 2 to about age 10. Now, of course, you're not going to give the same cognitive test to a 2-year-old as you would to a 10-year-old. So on the y-axis here, we have cognitive performance in percentile, or where children performed relative to other same-age peers. So first, I'm going to draw your attention to children who started out at age 2 at the 90th percentile, meaning they outperformed 90% of other 2-year-olds on this cognitive set of assessments. And these were children who happened to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. So those children from higher SES homes who happened to be high early scoring children tended to perform above average throughout the course of childhood. Next, I'll have you consider kids who started out at age 2 at the 10th percentile, so outperforming only 10% of other 2-year-olds, who happen to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. So those children from lower SES backgrounds who were low early scorers tended to perform below average throughout the course of childhood. So far, nothing that I've shown you is so surprising, but what's perhaps a bit more surprising is what happened to what we might term those crossover groups. So next, we'll consider children who also started out at the 10th percentile at age 2, but who came from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So those children actually rose in their relative ranks over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, they were performing at or even a little bit above average. And finally, and most disconcertingly, what happened to those children who started out outperforming 90% of other 2-year-olds, but who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds? So those children actually fell in their relative ranking over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, family socioeconomic background is actually a much better predictor of cognitive skill than is early cognitive ability. And just to make it perfectly explicit, it's not that these children, of course, lost cognitive abilities. It's just that they fell in their relative rank relative to same-age peers over the course of childhood. Now, in my lab, we're interested in trying to understand how these socioeconomic disparities in achievement relate to underlying differences in children's brain structure. So, for example, one area that we and others have repeatedly reported socioeconomic differences in is in children's learning and memory ability. So, on average, children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to show higher memory skills at various ages. Now, we've known for 50 years or so that memory is largely dependent on this structure shown here in green, the hippocampus. And we've also known for quite some time that, on average, a larger hippocampus is in many cases associated with better memory. So we reasoned that perhaps we would see socioeconomic differences in the size of children's hippocampus. And indeed, that's exactly what we've found, and that's now been replicated in 4 independent labs across the country. So this is an example of how socioeconomic differences in achievement may be supported or explained by socioeconomic differences in the brain. But of course, it begs the question as to what factors might be contributing to this gap, both in achievement and in brain structure. So of course, we could think of many things, right? Differences in nutrition, differences in prenatal care or perinatal complications, differences in prenatal drug exposure, exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home learning environment or schooling, and the difference that we're going to focus on today, namely differences in family stress. So as you might imagine, growing up in socioeconomic disadvantage tends to be associated with higher levels of family stress. And we know that when parents are distracted or depressed, family life is often characterized by conflict and emotional withdrawal, rather than the kinds of warm and nurturing, supportive parenting that we know is so beneficial for children. Now, work from my lab and others has suggested that oftentimes children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds have altered levels of stress hormones, notably cortisol. And work from both the animal and human literatures suggests that there are certain brain structures that are particularly responsive to differences in stress hormone or cortisol, notably the hippocampus. And so, in my lab, we're asking whether socioeconomic differences in exposure to family stress might lead to differences in the brain, including the hippocampus, which might support differences in cognitive outcomes, such as learning and memory. And so, to do that, we're taking advantage of the fact that cortisol is chronically secreted into hair. And so we can take a very small hair sample one time in the lab and get an average measure of cortisol or stress hormone over the last several months. And so then we can ask whether we see socioeconomic differences in hair cortisol and whether hair cortisol differences might be associated with differences in the brain. So in terms of the first question, we are seeing socioeconomic differences in hair cortisol. Here I'm showing you data where higher parental education is associated with lower hair cortisol in those parents. Similarly, higher parent education is associated with lower hair cortisol in their children, even when controlling for parents' hair cortisol levels. And finally, higher family income, or in this case, income to needs, which is simply income adjusted for family size, is also associated with lower levels of stress hormone in parents. But in this case, we see this nonlinear relationship, suggesting that a little bit of extra income goes a long way in changing stress physiology in parents. Now, what about the brain? Again, we're finding differences linking perceived stress with brain structure. So here in a large sample of adolescents, we found that higher levels of perceived stress was associated with smaller hippocampal volume, as we predicted. And in a smaller sample of younger children, we're again finding links between stress and brain structure. In this case, higher levels of parent hair cortisol are associated with smaller volumes of children's hippocampus. So if we're right that socioeconomic differences in children's experience has cascading effects on brain and subsequent behavior, and particularly if stressful experiences seem to be accounting for some of these differences, it begs the question as to whether this work could inform interventions, and if so, what's the right level at which to intervene? So certainly we could imagine intervening at what I'll call the most proximal level, at the level of cognition itself, through school-based interventions. Certainly this represents the most common form of intervention addressing socioeconomic disparities in achievement. Similarly, we could imagine changing children's experience most commonly through parenting interventions. Now, my colleagues on the panel are going to speak to some of these types of interventions, so I'm going to save the details for them, except I will say that, as I think they would attest, intervention science is really challenging. So it represents quite a challenge to be able to recruit and retain families in these kinds of interventional studies. Not to say that it's not a challenge well worth taking on, but it is often quite difficult to do. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to raise the question as to whether we potentially as a society could focus on the most distal level by changing SES itself. So correlational work suggests that small income differences can be associated with relatively large differences in children's outcomes. So for example, a small amount of increased income early in childhood has been correlated with increased adult earnings when those children grow up, increased time spent in the labor force when those children grow up, improvements in academic achievement, and even some suggestion of improved health in adulthood. But of course, as scientists, we need to move past correlation and ask whether differences in income could cause those differences. And to do that, we need to conduct the gold standard of scientific studies, namely a clinical trial. So I'm really pleased to be launching the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood, along with a series of collaborators in the social sciences at other universities. So although the ambition is large, the plan is rather simple. Our plan is to recruit 1,000 low-income mothers from a number of hospitals around the country shortly after having given birth. And all participants will be enrolled in an unconditional cash transfer for the first 40 months of their children's lives, meaning that they'll be randomized to either receive a large monthly cash supplement or a small monthly cash gift. And that cash gift is unconditional, meaning they can spend it on whatever they want. It's not conditioned on any particular behavior. They'll, as I mentioned, be enrolled in the hospital shortly after giving birth. Upon enrollment in the study, they'll receive a debit card that's preloaded, and that debit card will automatically reload each month on the anniversary of the children's birthday. So in this way, our plan is to study the causal impact of poverty reduction on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development over the first 3 years of life. We'll be following them up with a phone survey at age 1, a home visit at age 2 when we can measure some aspects of parenting, including stress physiology in the parents and kids, and finally at age 3 we'll be inviting the families into the university setting to do a complete assessment of the children's development. I'm happy to say that this work is being funded by NIH and a consortium of foundations, and we're planning to launch the study in the next few weeks. So how do we think that this increased cash is going to actually affect these families? So we've got two main pathways we're hypothesizing. One, as you might imagine, is we're calling the increased investment pathway. So this is the idea that with more cash resources, families will be able to invest in things like books and toys and trips to the museum, also potentially higher quality childcare, better housing, and better neighborhoods. And the other, critically for our purposes today, we're calling the reduced stress pathway. So this is this idea that if moms are less worried about keeping the lights on or paying that monthly rent check, that they'll be more able to invest in the kind of warm and nurturing parenting that we know is so critical for children's development. So our hope is that this study is poised to answer the question as to whether boosting family income can change children's trajectories for the better, having some potential policy implications. So we hope that we'll have the potential to provide direct evidence on the effects of poverty reduction on the developing brain and mind. And we're also hoping that we'll be able to inform debates on the generosity or cuts to social service programs, both existing programs as well as new ones that might affect millions of disadvantaged families, including a number of social service programs that have been in the news lately, like paid family leave or the minimum wage. And so, while I would never suggest that income is the only or the most important aspect of the developing brain, it may be the most manipulable from a policy perspective. So I'm hoping that I set the stage tonight for talking about the kinds of factors that might lead to increased parenting stress, subsequently resulting in trauma. And my colleagues, Dr. Nim Tottenham and Kristen Bernard, are really poised to talk a bit more about the impact of trauma specifically on the developing brain and mind, and what we might do to help prevent those deleterious outcomes. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I thank my lab members, collaborators, and funders, and I look forward to your questions in the panel subsequently.